Adjunct Professor Moran, Macroeconomics 111. This is a summative activity for this part of our discussion of aggregate expenditures. After this, we're going to discuss aggregate expenditures but added back in government spending and imports and exports. So here what we're going to do is we're going to consolidate consumption spending C and business spending IG, and then we're going to determine an equilibrium output of aggregate expenditures. And then we're going to shift aggregate expenditures either because of a shift in consumption or a shift in business spending and get a new equilibrium. We started by explaining consumption with respect to disposable income. Consumption has a slope less than a 45-degree reference line because some of the money will leak out of income and be saved. If you spent every dollar of disposable income on consumption, the consumption line would be a 45-degree reference line. But since you don't, you might spend, for every dollar increase in income, you may only spend 90 cents in consumption and save a dime. We made some powerful assumptions concerning disposable income and GDP. We assumed that there was no government, no imports or exports, all profits were paid out. And so that meant that we could just take this very same line and plunk it over here. And now we've got consumption with respect to GDP. We're trying to build a model that explains changes in GDP and current levels and what we can do about it. Now, when you have a change in income, you'll have a change in GDP. You'll write on the line. If income is explaining consumption, then a change in income you'll write up and down this line. Business spending. Business spending in dollars on new projects, we explained with changes in interest rates as a percentage. And it was a negative relationship. The demand for new business spending is a negative relationship with the amount that business want to spend with changes in interest rates. And we decided in order to get that on a graph with gross domestic product, we just had to pick out whatever the current interest rate was and take this amount of business spending and put it here, maybe 100. So business spending is said to be independent of changes in GDP. Now we need to get this on a graph together. So we're going to add C plus IG, which we can do because they have the same thing on these axes. C we're going to put here, and a constant amount to a line with a slope is a line with the same slope, a parallel line with the same slope. Okay. So now we have our consolidated aggregate expense model. So we're going to call C plus IG aggregate expenditures. Think of this as buying, think of this as making, and income. Okay. Now, the only thing that causes this to change is a change in price. But there are other things that cause this to change, and that's wealth, indebtedness, taxes, and expectations. These are shifters. So if the stock market goes up, consumption will rise. At any one level of income, if the stock market goes up, then increases in the stock market are doing savings for people. So at any one level of income, they'll consume more and save less, and the consumption line shifts up. So it's not income that's changing, it's wealth, indebtedness, taxes, expectations. It could be that they borrowed more money. It could be that taxes went down. It could be that they expect better things in the future. And so at any one level, they're spending more, and that gives us a new line. That would cause our aggregate expense line to shift by the amount of this shift in consumption. Now we have AE2 as opposed to AE1. We can disregard this line because all we need on this line, this consolidated line, is the aggregate expense line, the sum of C plus IG. So this is a shift in the aggregate expense line caused by a change in wealth, or an increase in indebtedness, a decrease in taxes, or a more positive outlook about the future. This line could have also been caused, this increase in aggregate expenditures could also have been caused by a lowering of interest rates. Interest rate IR1 to IR2 would cause business spending to increase from IG1 to IG2, maybe $200. And that would cause the same effect if these amounts were the same. This is a shift in aggregate expenditures caused by a lowering of interest rates and an increasing amount of business spending at all levels of GDP. We're now going to practice with some scenarios using shifters, rides on the line, and changes in interest rates. Let's assume we're starting at aggregate expenditures line 1. An increase would be to aggregate expenditures 2, a decrease would be to aggregate expenditures 3. That's because the equilibrium quantities on GDP would be moving accordingly. If this is the equilibrium quantity for AE1, this is the equilibrium quantity for AE2. GDP would be getting larger. This would be the equilibrium quantity for AE3. GDP would be getting smaller. Hopefully you've had a chance to print this and look it over, and this will be your answer key. The most important determinant of consumption is disposable income. Consumption, disposable income, a positive relationship. Non-income determinants of consumption are wealth, indebtedness, taxes, and expectations about the future. An increase in wealth will cause an increase in consumption. An increase in indebtedness will cause an increase in consumption, AE1 to AE2. A decrease in taxes at any one personal income, you'll have more disposable income, which will result at any one level of personal income having a higher level of consumption. And if you're more favorably optimistic about the future, you'll consume more out of current income and save less. So, we're no longer riding. It's no longer disposable income. Riding on one line. These are non-income determinants, and since if we ride on one line, we're implying that there is more consumption but more income. Here we're saying income is not changing, so you have to have a new line to demonstrate that. The most important determinant of business spending is interest rates. Interest rates are a cost, and so the higher the interest rate, the more cost it takes a business to undertake new business spending. So fewer projects will be profitable and less will be undertaken. But lower interest rates reduce the cost of new projects, resulting in higher profitability numbers and more projects meeting the hurdle and being undertaken. So for any one IG line, that is held constant. And so if interest rates change, the entire IG line changes. So if this is the current level of aggregate expenditures and interest rates fall, then business spending will increase and we will be on a new aggregate expense line. But if interest rates rise, then business spending falls and we'll have a new aggregate expense line at a lower amount, equilibrium. Let's practice a little bit with these ideas. For each of the following scenarios, indicate whether you kind of remain on aggregate expense line 1, increase to aggregate expense 2, or decrease to aggregate expense 3. Wages rise faster than inflation. Real income rises. So this is wages. Something that's going to shift aggregate expense. It would be an increase. So we would be going from AE1. This is going to cause consumption to rise at any one level of income, and so we'd be going to AE2. A shift in the aggregate expense line caused by a non-income determinant, wealth, income. Whoa, incorrect. My mistake. This is income. So we would be going from here to a disequilibrium point, for example, because that is income that's changing. So we'd be remaining on AE1, income being the most important predictor of consumption. So we'd be going from one point, maybe a disequilibrium to an equilibrium, or an equilibrium point to a disequilibrium. Income. Interest rates decrease. Now, interest rates decreasing will cause indebtedness to rise because the cost of borrowing is less. So that'll cause an increase in aggregate expenditures from AE1 to AE2. Income is not changing, but at any one level of income, people are consuming more because they're borrowing the money. So that would cause us to go from AE1 to AE2. It would also cause business spending to rise because as interest rates fall, the cost of new projects falls, more become profitable, and more business spending will be undertaken. So both C and IG would cause a shift in aggregate expense from AE1 to AE2. New equilibriums would go from GDP 1 to GDP 2. Interest rates decrease. So similarly, here we would have a decrease in consumption and a decrease in IG. As the cost of, let's call this an increase. As interest rates increase, the cost of borrowing to consumers rises, so they'll borrow less money to buy durable goods. For example, houses, not houses, cars, TVs, refrigerators. And business spending on new projects would also decrease because the higher cost of borrowing would decrease profits for all projects, resulting in more being unprofitable and less spending being undertaken. So we would fall from AE1 to AE3, a decrease in aggregate expenditures. GDP would fall from aggregate expenditure 1, GDP 1, to GDP 3. Stock market hits new high. That represents wealth. So we've done indebtedness, we've done wealth. Now the stock market hits new high. Since disposable income is either consumed or saved, in effect, the increase in the value of the stock market will result in people consuming more and savings less. And so at any one level of consumption, at any one level of income, people will consume more, and that would cause the aggregate expense line to increase. So we'd be moving from AE1 to AE2. That's an increase in aggregate expenditures. Workers expect massive layoffs. That's expectations. People are gloomy about the future. They're not going to actually wait until they get fired to cut back on spending. If they are fearful of a change in the future economic condition, they will react now. So if they're worried about losing their bonus or actually their entire job, they'll start cutting back now. And so at any one level of income, which has not changed yet, consumption will decrease and savings will rise. And we would go from AE1 to AE3, a shift in the aggregate expenditure line. Government reduces taxes. Personal income minus personal income taxes equals disposable income. Reducing personal income taxes would cause disposable income to rise, which would cause both consumption and savings to rise. So this decrease in government spending would cause us to shift from AE1 to AE2. Okay, now let's take some scenarios. Not all equilibriums are good equilibriums. There are only 3 things that can happen in this model concerning equilibriums. You can have full employment, which is where we want to go. It's the production of output sufficient to generate income that will cause buying to be equal to making. There is a recession where buying is insufficient to generate full employment output, GDP, and so our equilibrium will fall short. Our actual equilibrium of GDP will fall short of full employment. And there will be an inflationary equilibrium where society is trying to buy more aggregate expenditures than society is actually making. Again, think of aggregate expenditures as buying output. Right? Isn't one method of measuring GDP expenditures? There's your expenditure approach. Think of buying as making, right? GDP is the final market value of all goods and services produced in a period of time, and GDP is also an income measure. So now we have all definitions of GDP on one graph, and we're relating our buying method with our income method. For each scenario, answer twice, one for the scenario on the left and one for the scenario on the right. What would cause AE1 to shift to AE2 to a disequilibrium? Alright, from AE1 to here. Notice that if this line shifts up because of a change in wealth, indebtedness, taxes or expectations, or lower business interest rates, an increase in the stock market, increase in how much people are borrowing, a decrease in taxes, or a more optimistic view of the future, or a lower interest rate for businesses, aggregate expenditures will increase from AE1 to AE2. GDP has not yet changed, but aggregate expenditures has gone from AE1 to AE2. Here's where the 45-degree reference line comes into play. Buying, this is a disequilibrium. Anything on this side of the line, aggregate expenditures, is greater than GDP. Anything on this side of the line, GDP will be greater than aggregate expenditures. What's happening here is society is buying more output than businesses are making. As a result, inventories will decline. It will be an unplanned inventory decrease that is very good for business, because it means that not only are they selling what they thought they were, they're selling more than they thought they were. Businesses will hire more workers to produce more output. As a result, income will go up. Income is something that causes you to ride on one aggregate expense line. So we had a shift caused by a non-income determinant, and then a ride on a consumption line in response to the change in income. So two things are going to happen. One whacks us out of equilibrium, and then we have a change in income, which brings us along one line back to equilibrium. At this point, buying is equal to making, and there would be no need for businesses to change production, either higher or lower, and income would remain the same, and we would have an equilibrium. Now, for AE1 to AE2, so we've done this, right? What would cause an increase in wealth, an increase in indebtedness, a decrease in taxes, or an increase in expectations, or a decrease in interest rates for business spending? What would cause us to fall from AE1 to AE2? Well, that could be a decrease in the stock market. People would save more out of current income to protect their future retirement earnings in the stock market. It could be that people are borrowing less money. It could be that taxes have increased, or people are more fearful of the future, causing them to save more and consume less. It could be that interest rates have risen, causing business to cut back on their spending. These things have not yet caused anything to change about GDP. They've caused changes in aggregate expenditures, C and IG. So C and IG falls to here. Aggregate expenditures going from AE1 to AE2. Now we have a disequilibrium. Buying is no longer equal to making. Making is greater than buying because we're on this side of the 45-degree reference line. We have an increase in unplanned inventory changes. People aren't buying everything businesses are making. In order to correct that, inventories are expensive. Businesses will make less and lay workers off as a result. As a result of that, income falls. Income, being the primary determinant of consumption, will go down the line. We're going to ride on one income line once we are on this new line. And that restores us to equilibrium, AE3. We'll call it AE3, and this will be GDP. Call it A. Call this one A. And now buying is equal to making, and that is a stable equilibrium. Okay, so these are what causes either an increase in GDP or a decrease, an increase in aggregate expenditure or a decrease in aggregate expenditures. At this equilibrium, which is larger, making or buying? Well, here it was making. Buying was greater than making. Here, making was greater than buying. Would unplanned inventories increase or decrease? Here, because buying is greater than making, there is a decrease in unplanned inventories. But because making is greater than buying here, there is an increase in unplanned inventory changes. How would businesses respond to this inventory change in terms of output produced? Well, consumers are loving what businesses are making and buying more than they're making, so businesses would increase production. Here, though, businesses aren't selling everything they make, and there's an unplanned inventory increase, and so businesses would decrease production. What impact would the change in output produced have on unemployment? Well, if businesses are going to increase output, unemployment would fall. Unemployment would decrease. But if businesses are cutting back on production because not everything they're making is selling, then unemployment would increase. How would this change in unemployment affect income? A decrease in unemployment would cause more people to be hired, and income would increase. But if businesses are cutting back on output, then it will also be laying off workers, and income would decrease. This change in income would cause consumption to increase or decrease. An increase in consumption is the primary. An increase in disposable income is the primary cause or determinant of consumption. So consumption would also increase. But a decrease in disposable income being the primary determinant of consumption, would cause a decrease in consumption. This adjustment will continue making GDP until GDP is greater than equal than buying. This would continue until the two are equal. For both. This is the cause and effect mechanism that will take us from one equilibrium to another equilibrium. You just don't go from here to here. Something is going to happen, a shifter. Wealth, indebtedness, taxes, expectations, or change in interest rates. For C, for IG. That is going to take us from one equilibrium to a disequilibrium. Then, a resulting change in income will cause us to ride on the line. These are shifters. A shift and a ride in line. This is going to happen in this chapter repeatedly, as well as the next model that we make. In our next lessons, we're going to start introducing the more complete aggregate expense model by reintroducing government spending and taxes. Aggregate expense model: equilibrium, shifts to disequilibrium, and a restoration of equilibrium.